The yellow Pontiac Trans Am sat beneath the amber streetlight for 47 minutes each Tuesday evening, its position calculated to provide optimal observation angles while remaining inconspicuous among the legitimate traffic that flowed through Detroit's entertainment district. Its driver had selected this particular streetlight after weeks of surveillance, noting the way shadows fell across the vehicle's interior and how the tinted windows rendered him invisible to pedestrians and passing patrol cars. Through those darkened windows, he watched the ritual emergence of women from the Velvet Room, their sequined dresses catching fragments of neon that bled through the October air of 1979 like scattered prisms. Detroit's entertainment district hummed with the mechanical precision of a city rebuilding itself after the devastating riots of 1967, and in that reconstruction, in the daily choreography of urban renewal and nighttime commerce, certain patterns went unnoticed by authorities who had learned to focus on more obvious forms of criminal activity. Margaret Chen finished her Tuesday shift at exactly 10:37, her dance bag slung over her shoulder, with the unconscious grace of someone who had performed this routine hundreds of times. The bag contained her stage costumes, makeup supplies, and the tips she had collected during her 8-hour performance schedule. She walked the 3 blocks to the Woodward Avenue bus stop with the measured pace of a professional dancer, her footsteps echoing against the concrete sidewalks that stretched between the club district and the residential neighborhoods, where service workers like herself found affordable housing. The October wind carried the scent of burning leaves from distant suburbs and automotive exhaust from the Ford River Rouge plant, familiar smells that marked the transition between Detroit's industrial day and its illuminated night. Margaret had performed this same routine for 8 months, 5 nights a week, stepping from the club's warmth into Detroit's cooling air without considering that her predictability might attract unwanted observation. The Trans Am's engine turned over with practiced silence, its 8-cylinder motor tuned to minimize noise during startup. The driver had spent considerable time modifying the vehicle's exhaust system to achieve this near-silent operation, understanding that successful predation required the elimination of unnecessary sound. He followed Margaret's progress through his rearview mirror, noting her walking speed, her route selection, her moment of vulnerability, as she waited alone at the bus stop beneath inadequate street lighting. Margaret's absence was first noted by her roommate, Patricia Williams, on Thursday morning when the young woman failed to return from her Tuesday shift. Patricia discovered Margaret's bed unslept in, her breakfast dishes unwashed in their shared apartment's small kitchen, her work clothes still hanging in the closet where she had left them before departing for the Velvet Room. She contacted the club's management at 9:15 a.m., learning that Margaret had completed her scheduled performances and collected her tips before leaving at the usual time. The Detroit Police Department filed report number 79 to 10-0847 on October 25th, categorizing Margaret's disappearance as voluntary missing person after Patricia's initial interview with Desk Sergeant Robert McKinley. Adults, the sergeant explained with the weary patience of someone who had processed hundreds of similar reports, possessed the legal right to vanish without explanation or forwarding address. The bureaucratic classification reflected Detroit's overwhelmed police department and its prioritization of violent crimes over missing person cases that might resolve themselves through voluntary return. In 1979, the city's homicide rate had reached its highest point since the riots, consuming investigative resources that might otherwise have been allocated to cases like Margaret Chen's unexplained absence. The missing person unit consisted of 2 detectives handling caseloads that included runaway juveniles, domestic dispute disappearances, and adult vanishing cases that rarely received more than cursory investigation unless evidence of foul play emerged. 3 weeks later, on November 13th, Donna Kellerman completed her final dance at the Paradise Lounge in Hamtramck, a working-class suburb that bordered Detroit's northeast boundary. The yellow Trans Am had been parked across the street since 9:15, positioned beneath a broken streetlight that created pools of darkness where the vehicle's occupant could observe without being observed. The driver had expanded his territory to include Hamtramck after determining that Margaret Chen's disappearance had generated no significant police investigation or media attention. Donna emerged at 10:41, her breath visible in the November cold, as she pulled her coat tighter against the wind and walked toward the employee parking lot, where her pale blue Volkswagen Beetle waited beneath a flickering mercury vapor lamp. She never reached the car. The pattern established itself through methodical repetition, though Detroit's overwhelmed police department lacked the resources and interdisciplinary communication necessary to recognize the connections forming across jurisdictional lines. Margaret Chen had danced at the Velvet Room in downtown Detroit. Donna Kellerman worked the Paradise Lounge in Hamtramck. Janet Morrison performed at Club Mystique in Dearborn, a suburb southwest of the city center. Each woman vanished on a Tuesday night between October and December of 1979, each disappearance occurring within 3 blocks of their workplace, each victim aged between 22 and 26, each following employment schedules that had been observed and documented by their killer weeks before their abduction. Detective Raymond Walsh inherited Margaret Chen's case file in January 1980, when the Detroit Police Department reorganized its missing persons unit in response to budget cuts that reduced the division's staff from 6 officers to 4. Walsh had worked homicide for 6 years, long enough to recognize the subtle differences between spontaneous disappearance and methodical removal. Margaret Chen's apartment showed no signs of hasty departure, no evidence that she had packed belongings or withdrawn money in preparation for voluntary relocation. Her personal effects remained undisturbed in their original positions. Her bank account showed no activity since her disappearance, and her family in Oakland, California, had received no communication despite their previous pattern of weekly telephone contact. The detective's experience investigating violent crimes had taught him to recognize the behavioral signatures that distinguished planned disappearances from involuntary ones. Planned disappearances typically involved preliminary activities that left documentary traces: bank withdrawals, employment resignations, forwarding address arrangements, transportation reservations. Margaret Chen had engaged in none of these preparatory behaviors, suggesting that her absence resulted from circumstances beyond her control rather than personal choice. Walsh requested Margaret's employee records from the Velvet Room, discovering that she had worked consistently for 8 months, without unexplained absences or conflicts with management or customers. Her performance reviews indicated reliability and professionalism, contradicting theories that she might have fled employment-related difficulties. Her roommate described their relationship as harmonious and provided detailed accounts of Margaret's daily routines, social contacts, and emotional state immediately before her disappearance. The yellow Trans Am continued its Tuesday appearances throughout the winter of 1980, its driver expanding his hunting territory to include clubs in Warren, Lincoln Park, and Southfield, as he refined his selection criteria and operational methods. His victims were chosen according to specific parameters that investigators would not identify until much later. Women who worked alone, who maintained predictable schedules, who parked in poorly lit areas or relied on public transportation, who lacked immediate family connections in the metropolitan Detroit area. The hunter studied his environment with the systematic patience of someone who understood that rushed predation inevitably led to exposure and arrest. Thomas Edward Pritchard had begun developing his selection methodology during the summer of 1979, months before Margaret Chen's abduction. His approach combined mathematical precision with psychological observation, creating a framework that minimized risk while maximizing his ability to acquire suitable subjects for his evolving signature. He maintained detailed notes on potential victims, recording their schedules, transportation methods, social connections, and security awareness in a leather-bound journal that he kept locked in his bedroom dresser. The journal revealed Pritchard's analytical mind and his complete emotional detachment from his prospective victims' humanity. He referred to them by numerical designations rather than names, categorizing their suitability according to criteria that included physical resemblance to his deceased mother, predictable behavioral patterns, and minimal social connections that might generate immediate investigation following their disappearance. Each potential victim received a numerical score based on these factors, with the highest scoring individuals prioritized for eventual selection. Detective Walsh requested files from surrounding municipalities in March 1980, after Janet Morrison's sister contacted him about perceived similarities between Margaret Chen's case and Janet's November disappearance from Club Mystique in Dearborn. The request generated 37 missing person reports involving women aged 20 to 30 who had been employed in entertainment venues and last seen between October 1979 and February 1980. Of these 37 cases, 17 involved disappearances that had occurred on Tuesday nights, a statistical anomaly that suggested methodical rather than random selection. The detective recognized the pattern's significance and requested additional information from police departments in Oakland County, Macomb County, and Monroe County, expanding the investigation's geographical scope to include the entire southeastern Michigan metropolitan area. This broader inquiry produced another 14 missing person reports that matched the developing profile. Women employed as dancers or cocktail waitresses, aged 20 to 28, vanishing on Tuesday evenings without explanation or trace. The breadth of the pattern suggested a predator operating across multiple jurisdictions, exploiting the lack of communication between municipal police departments to avoid detection. In 1980, law enforcement agencies in the Detroit metropolitan area maintained separate record-keeping systems and rarely shared information about ongoing investigations unless specifically requested to do so. This bureaucratic isolation created opportunities for criminals who understood geographical boundaries and jurisdictional limitations. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source during the first week of April 1980. Bobby Castellanos managed security for 3 Detroit area clubs, including the Velvet Room, where Margaret Chen had worked, and the Paradise Lounge, where Donna Kellerman had vanished. His Tuesday night rotation between venues placed him in position to observe patterns that escaped the attention of club employees who worked at single locations. Castellanos had noted the recurring presence of a yellow Trans Am parked in different locations near each club, always positioned for optimal observation of employee entrances and exits. The security manager's military background had trained him to recognize surveillance behavior, and the Trans Am's consistent Tuesday appearances across multiple venues raised his suspicions sufficiently to prompt him to record partial license plate information and vehicle descriptions in his security log. When Detective Walsh contacted him during a routine follow-up interview regarding Margaret Chen's case, Castellanos mentioned his observations and provided the detective with 6 months of security notes that documented the Trans Am's appearances. The license plate information, though incomplete, provided the investigation's first tangible lead. Castellanos had recorded the first 2 letters DB and the final digit 7 of the Michigan license plate, narrowing the search parameters to manageable proportions. Motor Vehicle Department records contained 43 yellow Pontiac Trans Ams registered in Wayne County with license plates matching that pattern, a list that Detective Walsh assigned to 2 junior officers for systematic investigation. Officers McKenna and Voles spent most of April 1980 visiting addresses associated with the 43 vehicles, conducting what they characterized as routine registration verification interviews with each owner. 39 vehicles were accounted for through normal ownership verification, their owners providing satisfactory explanations for their vehicles' whereabouts during the relevant time periods. 3 Trans Ams had been sold to out-of-state buyers with proper title transfers documented. 1 vehicle belonged to Thomas Edward Pritchard of 1247 Elmwood Avenue in Redford Township. Pritchard's Trans Am sat in his driveway on the afternoon of April 22nd when officers McKenna and Voles arrived for what they presented as a routine registration verification visit. The 29-year-old auto plant worker answered their questions with calm precision that impressed both officers, explaining that he occasionally visited Detroit's entertainment district but had no specific recollection of any missing women. He worked the day shift at Ford Rouge's stamping plant, lived alone since his mother's death from cancer in November 1978, and spent his evenings reading mathematics textbooks or performing maintenance on his vehicle. The officers found nothing suspicious in Pritchard's responses, demeanor, or visible surroundings. His house showed normal levels of occupancy and maintenance, his garage contained standard automotive tools and supplies, and his basement served as organized storage for his deceased mother's belongings. which he explained he had been unable to dispose of due to emotional attachment. They thanked him for his cooperation and departed without requesting permission to search the premises or examine the vehicle in detail. Detective Walsh reviewed their report with growing frustration as the investigation approached its 5th month without producing viable suspects or significant evidence. The pattern analysis had consumed considerable time and resources while generating only circumstantial connections between geographically dispersed disappearances. Wayne County Prosecutor's Office had declined to authorize surveillance operations without stronger evidence linking specific individuals to the crimes, and the detective's superiors had begun pressuring him to focus on cases with greater potential for resolution. Thomas Pritchard resumed his Tuesday observations in May 1980, but implemented operational security modifications designed to eliminate the vehicle identification risk that Castellanos had created. He purchased a used 1976 Ford Econoline van from a private seller in Toledo, Ohio, paying $3,000 in cash and registering the vehicle under false identification that he had obtained through document forgery techniques learned during his military service in Germany from 1970 to 1973. The van's unremarkable appearance and common model type allowed him to position himself closer to the clubs without attracting attention from security personnel or police patrols. The signature he had been developing throughout the previous year reached its final form during this period of enhanced operational security. Each woman he selected received identical treatment following their abduction through chemical restraint methods that rendered them unconscious without causing immediate physical harm. Pritchard transported them to an abandoned warehouse in Delray, a largely vacant industrial area southeast of downtown Detroit, where he had established a carefully prepared workspace that reflected his mathematical training and obsessive personality. The warehouse had been vacant since 1977, when its manufacturing tenant, Great Lakes Automotive Parts, relocated operations to Nuevo Laredo, Mexico, in pursuit of lower labor costs. Pritchard had discovered the building during his systematic survey of abandoned industrial properties throughout the Detroit metropolitan area, a search that had consumed several weeks during the spring of 1979. The warehouse met his requirements for isolation, accessibility, and concealment, featuring a loading dock that had been damaged by vandals and provided unsecured entry to the building's interior. He gained regular access through this damaged entrance and established his workspace in the building's center bay, where concrete floors and high ceilings provided optimal acoustics and spatial arrangement for his developing signature. The signature involved precise positioning and mathematical timing that reflected Pritchard's undergraduate education in applied mathematics from Wayne State University, where he had completed 3 years of study before dropping out following his mother's illness. His academic background provided the theoretical framework for the geometric arrangements that became central to his methodology, combining elements of sacred geometry, Fibonacci ratios, and photographic composition to create what he considered artistically perfect presentations of death. Each victim was positioned according to specifications that Pritchard had refined through extensive practice, using mannequins purchased from department store liquidation sales. He arranged their hands in specific configurations, adjusted their hair to frame their faces according to classical proportional relationships, and ensured that their eyes remained closed in expressions of peaceful repose. The positioning process required between 90 minutes and 2 hours to complete, depending on the subject's physical proportions and the degree of rigor mortis that had developed. Pritchard photographed each arrangement using a Polaroid SX70 camera, creating images that captured the mathematical perfection of his compositions while providing permanent records of his achievements. The photographs served multiple purposes within his psychological framework. They functioned as trophies that validated his intellectual superiority, as artistic documents that preserved his creative vision, and as mathematical proofs that demonstrated his ability to impose order upon chaos through the systematic application of death. The photographs were organized in a custom leather portfolio according to chronological order and mathematical principles derived from the Fibonacci sequence. Each image occupied a position within the portfolio that corresponded to its numerical relationship to previous and subsequent photographs, creating a visual progression that followed mathematical rather than temporal logic. Pritchard spent considerable time arranging and rearranging the portfolio to achieve what he considered optimal aesthetic and mathematical harmony. Detective Walsh received an anonymous phone call at Detroit Police Headquarters on August 14, 1980, at approximately 2:15 p.m. The caller, speaking in a voice that suggested advanced age and possible intoxication, reported unusual activity at an abandoned warehouse located at 1847 West Jefferson Avenue in the Delray Industrial District. The man described observing vehicle headlights inside the building on multiple Tuesday nights during the previous several months, accompanied by what he characterized as mechanical sounds, resembling camera shutters or film advance mechanisms. The caller identified himself only as someone who minds his own business but knows something ain't right down there. Detective Walsh attempted to obtain additional information, but the caller terminated the connection before providing his name or contact information. The detective's subsequent investigation revealed that the warehouse had been vacant since 1977 and was owned by a Chicago-based real estate investment company that had purchased the property for eventual redevelopment. Detective Walsh visited the warehouse location on August 15th, conducting an exterior examination that revealed evidence of unauthorized entry through the damaged loading dock that the anonymous caller had mentioned. Fresh tire tracks in the gravel parking area suggested recent vehicle activity, and the detective observed that the building's electrical service had been illegally restored, presumably to provide lighting for whatever activities were occurring inside. The search warrant for the warehouse was authorized by Wayne County Circuit Judge Patricia Williams on August 16th, based on Detective Walsh's affidavit describing the anonymous tip, his personal observations of suspicious activity, and the connection between the reported Tuesday night timeline and the pattern of disappearances he had been investigating. The warrant authorized a complete search of the building's interior and the seizure of any evidence related to the missing person cases. Detective Walsh led a team of 6 officers through the damaged loading dock at dawn on August 17th, their flashlights revealing the workspace that Thomas Pritchard had constructed over the previous 15 months. The center bay had been transformed into what could only be described as a photographic studio designed specifically for documenting death. Portable lighting equipment, camera tripods, and positioning aids were arranged with mathematical precision around a central platform where Pritchard performed his signature arrangements. 23 Polaroid photographs lay arranged in a perfect logarithmic spiral on a plywood table that Pritchard had constructed according to specifications derived from the golden ratio. Each image showed a woman positioned identically according to the ritualistic formula he had developed, their hands folded across their chest in classical repose, their hair arranged to frame their faces in proportions that followed Renaissance artistic principles, their eyes closed in expressions that suggested peaceful sleep rather than violent death. The mathematical precision of the spiral's construction suggested hours of careful calculation and arrangement, with each photograph positioned to maintain exact proportional relationships to its neighbors according to principles that Detective Walsh would later learn derived from advanced geometric theory. The display represented Pritchard's attempt to transform murder into mathematics, death into art, chaos into order, through the application of intellectual frameworks that eliminated human empathy from the equation. The photographs included Margaret Chen, Donna Kellerman, Janet Morrison, and 7 other women whose disappearances had not been previously connected to the investigation. Detective Walsh recognized several faces from missing person reports he had reviewed during the previous months, understanding immediately that the warehouse contained evidence of a killing spree that had claimed at least 10 victims over a period of more than a year. Additional evidence recovered from the warehouse included detailed journal entries documenting Pritchard's selection criteria and operational methods, mathematical calculations related to the photographic arrangements, and a collection of personal items taken from each victim as additional trophies. The journal entries revealed the clinical nature of Pritchard's approach to murder, his complete emotional detachment from his victim's humanity, and his intellectual pride in having created what he considered a perfect synthesis of death and mathematics. Thomas Pritchard was arrested at his Redford Township home on August 17, 1980, at approximately 11:30 a.m. as he returned from his shift at the Ford Rouge plant. He offered no resistance to Officers McKenna and Volz, who had been assigned to make the arrest based on their previous contact with the suspect. Pritchard requested permission to secure his house and feed his cat before being transported to Wayne County Jail, demonstrating the same calm consideration for practical details that had characterized his approach to methodical murder. During initial interrogation, Pritchard waived his right to legal representation and described his activities with the clinical precision that would characterize all his subsequent interactions with law enforcement and legal personnel. He explained that his victims had been selected according to mathematical criteria based on their physical resemblance to his deceased mother, who had worked as a dancer in Detroit clubs during the 1950s before marrying his father and assuming domestic responsibilities. The victim selection process, Pritchard explained, involved weeks of observation and data collection to determine each woman's suitability according to his established parameters. He studied their work schedules, transportation methods, social connections, and behavioral patterns before making final selection decisions based on numerical scoring systems that quantified their value as subjects for his photographic project. The mathematical approach ensured optimal results while minimizing operational risks that might compromise his ability to continue the work. Pritchard described the killing process in technical terms that emphasized method over emotion, explaining that he used chloroform to render victims unconscious before transporting them to the warehouse for positioning and photography. The chemical approach ensured that subjects remained peaceful and cooperative during the arrangement process, avoiding struggle or resistance that might interfere with achieving optimal aesthetic results. Death occurred through controlled asphyxiation that left no marks or evidence of violence, preserving the illusion of peaceful repose that was central to his artistic vision. The positioning and photography served what Pritchard called his mathematical imperative, a philosophical framework that justified murder as necessary for creating perfect geometric relationships impossible to achieve with living subjects. He had spent considerable time developing theoretical justifications for his activities, drawing upon advanced mathematical concepts and artistic principles to create intellectual rationalizations for behavior that he understood was socially unacceptable but mathematically essential. 7 bodies were recovered from a concealed burial area beneath the warehouse floor during the following week, each wrapped in plastic sheeting and positioned according to the same geometric principles that governed Pritchard's photographic arrangements. The burial site had been excavated with mathematical precision, creating individual graves that maintained exact spacing and depth measurements, according to calculations documented in Pritchard's journal. The victims had died through asphyxiation, occurring within hours of their abduction, pathological examinations revealing no evidence of sexual assault or physical torture. Pritchard had killed them cleanly and efficiently, treating their deaths as necessary steps in his creative process rather than sources of psychological gratification. The clinical nature of the murders reflected his intellectual approach to serial killing, demonstrating that extreme violence could result from mathematical obsession rather than emotional pathology. Pritchard's detailed records allowed investigators to identify each victim and reconstruct the timeline of murders spanning from October 1979 through July 1980. The documentation included photographs of each crime scene, maps showing abduction locations, and mathematical calculations related to the spacing and arrangement of burial sites. His record-keeping reflected the same obsessive precision that characterized his approach to victim selection and body positioning. The trial of Thomas Edward Pritchard began in Wayne County Circuit Court on February 3, 1981. With Judge Margaret O'Brien presiding over proceedings that generated extensive media coverage throughout Michigan and received national attention from news organizations interested in the mathematical aspects of the case. Pritchard's attorney, Robert Davidson, attempted an insanity defense based on the argument that his client's mathematical approach to murder indicated severe mental illness rather than criminal responsibility. The insanity defense focused on expert testimony regarding Pritchard's psychological condition and his ability to distinguish between right and wrong at the time of the murders. Defense psychiatrists argued that his mathematical obsessions represented symptoms of underlying psychotic illness that had distorted his perception of reality and eliminated his capacity for moral reasoning. They characterized his geometric arrangements and Fibonacci calculations as evidence of delusional thinking rather than deliberate criminal planning. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Robert Steinberg, focused on the premeditated nature of Pritchard's crimes and his clear understanding of their illegal nature. They presented extensive evidence of his planning and preparation, including his purchase of the Ford van under false identification, his systematic victim surveillance, and his construction of the warehouse workspace. The mathematical sophistication of his methods, they argued, demonstrated intellectual competence rather than mental illness. Expert testimony revealed the mathematical principles underlying Pritchard's signature methodology. Dr. Amanda Foster, a forensic psychiatrist from the University of Michigan Medical School, explained that his arrangements followed advanced geometric principles, including the golden ratio, Fibonacci sequences, and logarithmic spirals found throughout natural systems. This level of mathematical sophistication, she testified, indicated complete mental competence and demonstrated his ability to apply complex theoretical knowledge to practical problems. Dr. Foster's testimony particularly emphasized the calculated nature of Pritchard's mathematical arrangements, noting that achieving the precise proportional relationships documented in his photographs required extensive planning and mathematical computation. The defendant had not simply imposed random patterns on his victims, but had created sophisticated geometric compositions that demonstrated advanced knowledge of mathematical principles and artistic theory. The prosecution's mathematical expert, Professor James Mitchell from Wayne State University's Mathematics Department, provided detailed analysis of Pritchard's calculations and their relationship to established mathematical principles. Professor Mitchell explained that the Fibonacci sequence represented one of mathematics' most fundamental patterns, appearing throughout natural systems from flower petal arrangements to galaxy spiral formations. Pritchard's application of these principles to murder, he testified, demonstrated sophisticated mathematical knowledge rather than psychotic delusion. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on 10 counts of first-degree murder, rejecting the defense's insanity argument in favor of the prosecution's evidence of premeditation and intellectual competence. The mathematical complexity of Pritchard's methods had convinced jurors that he possessed complete awareness of his actions and their consequences, making him fully responsible for his crimes despite his unusual motivations. Judge O'Brien sentenced Thomas Edward Pritchard to death by electrocution, a sentence to be carried out at the Southern Michigan Correctional Facility in Jackson. The multiple murder conviction and the exceptionally cruel nature of his crimes warranted Michigan's ultimate penalty, reflecting society's judgment that mathematical sophistication could not excuse or mitigate the deliberate taking of human life for artistic purposes. Pritchard showed no emotional reaction when the sentence was read, maintaining the clinical detachment that had characterized his courtroom demeanor throughout the trial. He used his final opportunity to address the court to elaborate on his mathematical theories, describing the Fibonacci spiral as nature's most perfect pattern and explaining his work as an attempt to achieve mathematical perfection impossible with living subjects. The families of his victims listened to this explanation with growing horror, watching him reduce their daughters and sisters to variables in geometric equations. The execution of Thomas Edward Pritchard occurred on October 15, 1983, at 12:01 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Following the exhaustion of his legal appeals and clemency requests, he declined to make a final statement to witnesses or media representatives, instead requesting that his mathematical notebooks and photographic collection be donated to academic institutions for scholarly study. The request was denied by court order, and all materials related to his crimes were destroyed to prevent their use as instructional materials by future killers. Detective Walsh attended the execution as an official witness, fulfilling a promise he had made to the victims' families during the investigation and trial proceedings. He observed Pritchard's final moments with the same clinical attention that had characterized his entire involvement with the case, noting the mathematical precision with which the state of Michigan carried out its own form of methodically planned death. The warehouse in Delray was demolished in November 1983, its contaminated foundation removed, and the site converted to industrial storage for legitimate businesses. The demolition eliminated physical evidence of Pritchard's activities while creating space for economic redevelopment that would serve Detroit's continuing industrial recovery. The Ford van that Pritchard had used for victim transport was crushed and recycled according to court order, its metal contributing to new vehicles that carried no memory of its previous criminal purpose. The yellow Trans Am was sold at police auction in December 1983, purchased by a classic car enthusiast who restored it to original condition without knowledge of its connection to the investigation. The vehicle eventually became part of a private collection in California, where it remains as an anonymous artifact of automotive history rather than criminal evidence. Margaret Chen's dance bag and personal effects were returned to her family in Oakland, California, in January 1984, along with a letter from Detective Walsh explaining the investigation's outcome and expressing his department's condolences for their loss. Her parents established the Margaret Chen Memorial Scholarship Fund for young dancers, creating an educational legacy that transformed their daughter's death into opportunities for other aspiring performers. Donna Kellerman's Volkswagen Beetle remained in the Hamtramck police impound lot until 1985, when it was finally sold to cover accumulated storage fees. The vehicle was purchased by a college student who drove it for several years before trading it for a more reliable car, unaware of its connection to the serial killer investigation. The investigation's outcome revealed systematic vulnerabilities in law enforcement's approach to serial crime investigation, particularly the lack of communication between municipal police departments that had allowed Pritchard to operate across jurisdictional boundaries without detection. Wayne County implemented new protocols for sharing missing person information and coordinating investigations involving multiple municipalities, though these administrative improvements came too late to help Pritchard's victims. Detective Walsh transferred to the Federal Bureau of Investigation Academy in Quantico, Virginia, in 1984, where he helped develop training protocols for local law enforcement officers investigating serial crimes that crossed jurisdictional boundaries. His experience with the Pritchard case contributed to federal guidelines for recognizing patterns in geographically dispersed crimes and coordinating multi-agency investigations. The mathematical sophistication of Pritchard's signature methodology fascinated behavioral analysts at the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, who recognized the case as evidence that serial killers could operate at higher levels of intellectual abstraction than previously documented. Most serial killers left signatures that reflected psychological needs, sexual compulsions, or emotional disorders. Pritchard had created something closer to conceptual art, using human death as raw material for mathematical exploration and aesthetic expression. The case files became part of the FBI's training curriculum for agents specializing in serial crime investigation, serving as an example of how intellectual sophistication could amplify rather than prevent criminal behavior. Pritchard had demonstrated that advanced education and mathematical training could create predators who operated with terrifying efficiency while maintaining complete emotional detachment from their victims' humanity. The families of Pritchard's victims struggled for years to comprehend the mathematical abstraction of their loss, unable to understand how their daughters and sisters had been reduced to components in geometric equations. Margaret Chen's mother spent considerable time trying to reconcile her daughter's dreams of professional dance performance with her role as a numerical value in a Fibonacci sequence, finding no comfort in the intellectual framework that had motivated her killing. Support groups for families of serial killer victims provided some assistance in processing the unique trauma associated with mathematically motivated murder, though the clinical nature of Pritchard's approach created psychological challenges that differed from those experienced by families of conventional serial killer victims. The absence of sexual or emotional motivation made his crimes seem simultaneously more and less comprehensible, creating confusion about how to interpret his actions within normal frameworks of human behavior. Thomas Pritchard's death marked the conclusion of a case that had demonstrated the intersection between intellectual achievement and moral absence, between mathematical genius and psychological emptiness. He had killed 10 women to create geometric arrangements that existed only in his mind, sacrificing human lives to achieve aesthetic perfection that no one else could perceive or appreciate. The Tuesday night rhythm of Detroit's entertainment district gradually returned to normal patterns following Pritchard's execution and the media attention surrounding his case. Dancers emerged from clubs at closing time, walked to their cars or public transportation, and returned safely to their apartments and families without the threat of mathematical predation. The yellow Trans Am's absence went unnoticed among the anonymous flow of traffic that characterized urban nightlife in a city rebuilding itself around new economic and social patterns. In the end, Thomas Edward Pritchard had achieved his mathematical perfection only through the ultimate stillness of death, both his own and that of his victims. His geometric theories died with him on October 15, 1983, leaving only the memory of 10 women who had been transformed into numerical values in equations that solved for nothing beyond the satisfaction of intellectual pride disconnected from human empathy. The warehouse's demolished foundation settled into Detroit's industrial landscape as an anonymous element of urban renewal, indistinguishable from hundreds of other sites where obsolete manufacturing had been replaced by modern commercial development. The city rebuilt itself around these vacant spaces, creating new patterns of economic activity and residential growth that buried the old configurations of crime and death beneath layers of legitimate progress. Detective Walsh maintained copies of the complete case files in his FBI office throughout his federal career, referencing them whenever he encountered killers who imposed intellectual frameworks on their criminal activities. The Pritchard case served as a permanent reminder that intelligence and education could amplify rather than prevent criminal behavior, creating predators who operated with academic sophistication while maintaining complete moral absence. The mathematical beauty of Fibonacci spirals continued to appear throughout natural systems, in nautilus shell growth patterns and sunflower seed arrangements, in galaxy formations and DNA double helix structures. Thomas Pritchard's attempt to impose this natural pattern on human death had represented an obscene corruption of mathematical order, a demonstration that intellectual knowledge without emotional intelligence produced only sophisticated forms of destruction. Years later, when FBI profilers encountered serial killers who left mathematical signatures, arranged victims according to geometric principles, or demonstrated unusual intellectual sophistication, they referenced the Pritchard case as evidence that organized intelligence could serve evil as efficiently as good. The case files contained detailed documentation of mathematical murder, preserving evidence of a mind that had transformed death into arithmetic with clinical precision. The families of Pritchard's victims gradually reconstructed their lives around the permanent absence of daughters, sisters, and friends who had been reduced to elements in geometric proofs. They attended trials of other serial killers, advocated for improved missing person investigation procedures, and created memorial scholarships and victim support organizations. Their activism helped prevent other families from experiencing similar losses, though it could never restore what Thomas Edward Pritchard had systematically taken from them. Margaret Chen's mother returned to Detroit in October 1995, 15 years after her daughter's disappearance and 12 years after her killer's execution. She visited the site where the Delray warehouse had stood, finding only an empty lot where new industrial construction was planned. The mathematical precision that had motivated her daughter's death seemed even more incomprehensible in this setting of natural vegetation growth and unplanned urban decay. She stood in the space where her daughter had died and attempted to understand the intellectual framework that had motivated Thomas Pritchard's transformation of murder into mathematics. The understanding never came, and she realized that some patterns of human behavior were meant to remain incomprehensible to minds that retained the capacity for love, loss, and emotional connection to other human beings. The wind moved through the empty lot, disturbing papers and debris in patterns that followed no mathematical sequence or geometric principle. This randomness, this natural chaos, seemed more honest and authentic than Pritchard's calculated arrangements of death. Life itself resisted the imposition of perfect mathematical order, finding meaning in spontaneity, surprise, and the unpredictable interactions between people who chose connection over isolation. Detroit's entertainment district continued to serve dancers, musicians, and performers who emerged from venues throughout the week without fear of mathematical predation or geometric calculation. They walked to their cars, rode public transportation, and returned safely to homes and families in a city that had learned to distinguish between intellectual achievement and moral development, between mathematical sophistication and human wisdom. In this restoration of random safety and unpredictable human interaction, the victims of Thomas Edward Pritchard found their only authentic justice. His perfect mathematical stillness had been replaced by the imperfect motion of ongoing life, his calculated geometric death by the chaotic survival of others who continued to dance and dream and depart safely into Detroit's illuminated nights, their movements following no pattern except the fundamental rhythm of human hope, persisting beyond the reach of those who would reduce life to numerical values in equations that solved only for emptiness. The psychological evaluation of Thomas Edward Pritchard during his pre-trial confinement revealed additional layers of intellectual sophistication that distinguished his case from typical serial killer profiles. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, chief psychiatrist at Wayne County Jail, conducted extensive interviews that documented his mathematical obsessions while confirming his complete legal competency and awareness of his actions' consequences. Her reports described a mind that operated with mechanical precision while lacking fundamental human empathy, creating calculations where most people experienced emotions. Pritchard's mathematical journals, recovered from his Redford Township home during the post-arrest search, contained hundreds of pages documenting his theoretical framework for what he termed geometric mortality. The writings demonstrated advanced knowledge of mathematical principles combined with philosophical arguments, justifying murder as necessary for achieving perfect aesthetic arrangements. He had spent considerable time developing intellectual rationalizations for behavior that he understood violated social laws while serving what he considered higher mathematical imperatives. The journals revealed his systematic approach to victim selection, with detailed mathematical analyses of each woman's physical proportions and their suitability for inclusion in his Fibonacci spiral arrangements. He had measured facial dimensions, calculated body ratios, and assigned numerical scores based on how closely each potential victim approximated his deceased mother's measurements, which he had preserved through precise documentation following her death from cancer in 1978. His mother's death had apparently triggered the psychological transformation that led to his killing spree, though investigators found no evidence of sexual or emotional dysfunction in his relationship with her. Instead, her death seemed to have created an intellectual void that he filled through mathematical projects designed to achieve permanent preservation of her physical form through surrogate subjects who resembled her according to his calculated measurements. The trial testimony revealed that Pritchard had maintained detailed photographic documentation of his mother during her illness, taking hundreds of pictures that he analyzed mathematically to determine optimal ratios and proportions for his subsequent victim arrangements. This systematic documentation suggested long-term planning that predated Margaret Chen's abduction by several months, indicating that his killing spree represented the implementation of theoretical frameworks rather than spontaneous criminal behavior. Expert witnesses during the penalty phase described Pritchard's psychological condition as unique among documented serial killer cases, representing an intersection of mathematical genius and complete emotional absence that created unprecedented challenges for psychiatric classification. His intellectual capabilities placed him in the superior range of measured intelligence, while his empathy assessments indicated near-complete absence of normal emotional responses to human suffering or death. Dr. Foster's testimony emphasized that Pritchard's mathematical arrangements demonstrated sophisticated understanding of natural patterns and artistic principles, suggesting that his education and intellectual development had provided him with tools that amplified rather than prevented his criminal behavior. His case challenged traditional assumptions about the relationship between education and moral development, demonstrating that intellectual achievement could serve destructive purposes when disconnected from emotional intelligence. The prosecution's psychological experts characterized Pritchard as representing a new category of serial killer, the intellectualized predator who transformed murder into academic exercise through the application of theoretical frameworks that eliminated human empathy from consideration. His mathematical approach to killing suggested calculated planning rather than emotional compulsion, making him fully responsible for his actions despite his unusual motivations. Defense psychiatric testimony attempted to characterize Pritchard's mathematical obsessions as symptoms of underlying mental illness that distorted his perception of reality and eliminated his capacity for moral reasoning. Dr. Robert Steinfeld from Michigan State University argued that the defendant's geometric arrangements represented delusional thinking rather than deliberate criminal planning, suggesting that his intellectual sophistication masked fundamental disconnection from reality. The prosecution successfully countered this argument by demonstrating that Pritchard's mathematical calculations were entirely accurate and his geometric arrangements precisely executed according to established principles. His theoretical knowledge reflected legitimate academic understanding rather than delusional thinking, indicating complete awareness of his actions and their practical consequences for his victims. The jury's rejection of the insanity defense reflected their determination that intellectual sophistication could not excuse deliberate murder, regardless of the mathematical frameworks that motivated the defendant's behavior. Their verdict established legal precedent for holding academically gifted criminals fully responsible for their actions, even when those actions reflected unusual theoretical motivations rather than conventional criminal impulses. Judge O'Brien's sentencing statement emphasized that Thomas Edward Pritchard's mathematical education and intellectual capabilities made his crimes more rather than less serious, representing a betrayal of educational privileges and intellectual gifts that should have served constructive rather than destructive purposes. His transformation of academic knowledge into tools for systematic murder warranted society's ultimate penalty as both punishment and protection against future crimes. The execution process that concluded on October 15, 1983, represented the mathematical precision that Pritchard had sought to impose on his victims' deaths. The state of Michigan carried out his sentence according to established legal protocols that eliminated uncertainty and emotional variability, creating the methodical conclusion to a case that had begun with equally systematic predation. Pritchard's final hours were documented by prison officials, who noted his continued focus on mathematical concepts even as death approached. He spent his last afternoon calculating geometric relationships in a notebook that guards provided, working through theoretical problems that apparently provided intellectual satisfaction despite his circumstances. His mathematical obsessions persisted until consciousness ended, suggesting that his intellectual framework had completely replaced normal emotional responses to mortality. The destruction of his photographic collection and mathematical journals following his execution eliminated physical evidence of his theoretical frameworks while preserving public safety by preventing the materials from serving as instructional resources for future killers. Court officials supervised the incineration of all materials related to his mathematical methodology, ensuring that his intellectual legacy would not inspire similar crimes. The families of Pritchard's victims attended various stages of the legal proceedings, watching the systematic processing of their daughter's killer through judicial mechanisms that reflected the same methodical precision that had characterized his crimes. The institutional response to his mathematical murder represented society's attempt to impose its own forms of calculated justice, creating symmetrical conclusion to crimes that had begun with equally systematic planning. Margaret Chen's parents established their scholarship fund with the specific intention of supporting young dancers whose dreams had been interrupted by financial rather than criminal circumstances, transforming their daughter's death into educational opportunities that served life rather than death. The scholarship recipients were selected according to artistic merit and financial need, creating mathematical calculations that served constructive rather than destructive purposes. The scholarship program expanded over subsequent years, eventually supporting hundreds of dancers whose careers were enabled by educational assistance that honored Margaret's memory through positive achievement rather than mathematical precision applied to death. The fund's success demonstrated how systematic thinking could serve human development when guided by empathy and connection rather than intellectual isolation. Donna Kellerman's family established a similar memorial fund focused on supporting young women pursuing careers in entertainment industries, providing financial assistance and safety education that addressed the occupational vulnerabilities that Pritchard had exploited in selecting his victims. Their program specifically emphasized security awareness and workplace safety protocols that protected performers from predators who studied their routines for criminal purposes. The implementation of improved missing person investigation protocols throughout southeastern Michigan created systematic approaches to identifying patterns in unexplained disappearances, preventing future serial killers from exploiting jurisdictional boundaries as Pritchard had done. The new procedures required regular communication between municipal police departments and standardized reporting methods that revealed connections across geographical boundaries. Detective Walsh's subsequent career with the Federal Bureau of Investigation contributed to national training programs that prepared local law enforcement officers to recognize and investigate serial crimes involving intellectual sophistication and mathematical methodology. His expertise became part of federal curricula that addressed the unique challenges posed by academically gifted criminals who applied theoretical knowledge to systematic predation. The Pritchard case influenced FBI behavioral analysis programs that studied relationships between educational achievement and criminal behavior, contributing to psychological profiles that recognized intelligence as a potential amplifier rather than preventive factor in serial crime development. The case files provided evidence that intellectual gifts required moral education to serve constructive rather than destructive purposes. Contemporary criminology textbooks include detailed analysis of Pritchard's mathematical methodology as an example of how academic knowledge can serve criminal purposes when disconnected from ethical development and human empathy. His case demonstrates the importance of integrating intellectual education with moral instruction to prevent the creation of sophisticated predators who apply theoretical knowledge to systematic violence. The mathematical principles that Pritchard corrupted through his application to murder continue to serve legitimate purposes in academic and professional contexts where they contribute to scientific discovery, artistic creation, and technological development. The Fibonacci sequence appears throughout natural systems and human innovations as evidence of underlying order that serves life rather than death, creating beauty rather than destroying it. The distinction between constructive and destructive applications of mathematical knowledge serves as a permanent lesson from Pritchard's case, demonstrating that intellectual tools derive their moral value from the purposes they serve, rather than their theoretical sophistication. Mathematics itself remains neutral, gaining ethical significance only through human choices about how knowledge will be applied to serve either construction or destruction. The ultimate justice for Pritchard's victims exists not in mathematical precision, but in the continued vitality of human activities that resist reduction to numerical values or arrangements. Life persists in forms that defy systematic control, creating spontaneous beauty from unpredictable interactions rather than calculated impositions upon unwilling subjects. The dancers continue their work, moving through Detroit's illuminated nights in patterns that follow no sequence, their freedom serving as permanent testimony to triumph of human spontaneity over calculated death. Detective Raymond Walsh of the Detroit Police Department inherited the Chen case in January 1980, when the department reorganized its missing persons unit. Walsh had worked homicide for 6 years, long enough to recognize the difference between spontaneous disappearance and methodical removal. Margaret Chen's apartment showed no signs of hasty departure. Her belongings remained undisturbed, her bank account untouched, her family in California receiving no communication. The yellow Trans Am continued its Tuesday appearances throughout the winter of 1980, its driver expanding his territory to include clubs in Warren, Lincoln Park, and Southfield. His selections followed criteria that investigators would not identify until much later: women who worked alone, who parked in poorly lit areas, who maintained predictable schedules. The hunter studied his environment with the patience of someone who understood that rushed predation led to exposure. Detective Walsh requested files from surrounding municipalities in March 1980, after Janet Morrison's sister contacted him about similarities between the cases. The request generated 37 missing person reports involving women aged 20 to 30 employed in entertainment venues, last seen between October 1979 and February 1980. 17 of these disappearances occurred on Tuesday nights. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Bobby Castellanos managed security for 3 Detroit area clubs, including the Velvet Room where Margaret Chen had worked. His Tuesday nights rotated between venues, and his trained observation had noted the yellow Trans Am's recurring presence. Castellanos mentioned the vehicle to Detective Walsh during a routine follow-up interview, describing it as a late 70s model with tinted windows and Michigan plates, beginning with the letters DB. Motor Vehicle Department records contained 43 yellow Pontiac Trans Ams registered in Wayne County, with license plates matching that pattern. Detective Walsh assigned 2 junior officers to visit each address, a process that consumed most of April 1980. 39 vehicles were accounted for through normal ownership verification. 3 had been sold to out-of-state buyers. 1 belonged to Thomas Edward Pritchard of Redford Township. Pritchard's Trans Am sat in his driveway on the afternoon of April 22nd, when officers McKenna and Voles arrived at his address. The 29-year-old auto plant worker answered their questions with calm precision, explaining that he occasionally visited Detroit's clubs, but had no specific recollection of any missing women. He worked the day shift at Ford Rouge, lived alone since his mother's death in 1978, and spent his evenings reading or working on his car. The officers found nothing suspicious in Pritchard's responses or demeanor. His house showed normal levels of occupancy, his garage contained standard automotive tools. His basement served as storage for his deceased mother's belongings. They thanked him for his cooperation and departed. Detective Walsh reviewed their report with growing frustration. The investigation had consumed 4 months and produced only circumstantial connections. Wayne County Prosecutor's Office had declined to authorize surveillance without stronger evidence. The missing women remained missing, their families demanding answers that the department could not provide. Thomas Pritchard resumed his Tuesday observations in May 1980, but modified his approach to eliminate the vehicle identification risk. He purchased a used Ford van from a private seller in Toledo, paying cash and registering it under a false name with stolen identification. The van's unremarkable appearance allowed him to position himself closer to the clubs without attracting attention from security personnel or police patrols. The signature he had been developing throughout the previous year reached its final form during this period. Each woman he selected received the same treatment after being rendered unconscious through chemical means. He transported them to an abandoned warehouse in Delray, where he maintained a carefully prepared environment. The warehouse had been vacant since 1977, when its manufacturing tenant relocated operations to Mexico. Pritchard gained access through a damaged loading dock and established his workspace in the building's center bay. The signature involved precise placement and timing. Each victim was positioned in a specific arrangement that Pritchard had refined through practice. He photographed them using a Polaroid camera, creating images that he organized in a loose-leaf binder according to chronological order. The photographs served as trophies, but their arrangement followed a mathematical pattern that would eventually provide investigators with crucial evidence. Detective Walsh received an anonymous phone call on August 14, 1980. The caller, later identified as a homeless man who sheltered in abandoned buildings, reported unusual activity at the Delray warehouse. The man had observed vehicle headlights inside the building on multiple Tuesday nights and heard what he described as mechanical sounds, like cameras clicking. The search warrant for the warehouse was authorized on August 16th. Detective Walsh led a team of 6 officers through the damaged loading dock at dawn, their flashlights revealing the workspace that Thomas Pritchard had constructed over the previous 10 months. 23 Polaroid photographs lay arranged in a perfect spiral pattern on a plywood table. Each image showed a woman positioned identically, their hands folded across their chest, their hair arranged to frame their face, their eyes closed. The mathematical precision of the spiral's construction suggested hours of careful arrangement and rearrangement. The photographs included Margaret Chen, Donna Kellum and Janet Morrison, and 4 other women whose disappearances had not been connected to the investigation. Detective Walsh recognized the clinical nature of the display, the way each image contributed to a larger design that existed only in the killer's mind. Thomas Pritchard was arrested at his Redford Township home on August 17, 1980. He offered no resistance and made no attempt to deny his activities. During interrogation, he described his process with the same calm precision he had demonstrated to Officers McKenna and Voles 4 months earlier. The victims, he explained, had been selected for their resemblance to his deceased mother, who had been a dancer in Detroit clubs during the 1950s. He had studied their routines for weeks before making contact, using chloroform to render them unconscious before transport to the warehouse. The positioning and photography served to create what he called perfect stillness, a state that the living could never achieve naturally. 7 bodies were recovered from a concealed burial area beneath the warehouse floor. The women had been killed through asphyxiation, their deaths occurring within hours of their disappearance. Pritchard had maintained detailed records of each encounter, including dates, locations, and photographic reference numbers. The trial of Thomas Edward Pritchard began in Wayne County Circuit Court on February 3, 1981. Judge Margaret O'Brien presided over proceedings that lasted 11 days and generated extensive media coverage throughout Michigan. Pritchard's attorney attempted an insanity defense, arguing that his client's mathematical approach to murder indicated severe mental illness rather than criminal intent. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Robert Steinberg, focused on the premeditated nature of Pritchard's crimes. They presented evidence of his vehicle purchases, warehouse preparation, and photographic documentation to demonstrate clear planning and awareness of consequences. The spiral arrangement of photographs particularly impressed the jury as evidence of deliberate organization rather than psychotic behavior. Expert testimony revealed the mathematical sophistication underlying Pritchard's signature. Dr. Amanda Foster, a psychiatrist from the University of Michigan, explained that the spiral pattern followed the Fibonacci sequence, with each photograph positioned according to a specific ratio that Pritchard had calculated in advance. This level of mathematical planning, she testified, indicated complete mental competence. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on 7 counts of first-degree murder. Judge O'Brien sentenced Thomas Edward Pritchard to death by electrocution, a sentence to be carried out at the Southern Michigan Correctional Facility in Jackson. The sentence reflected Michigan's application of capital punishment for multiple homicides committed with exceptional cruelty. Pritchard showed no emotion when the sentence was read. He had used his trial testimony to explain his mathematical theories in detail, describing the Fibonacci spiral as nature's most perfect pattern and arguing that his work represented an attempt to impose natural order on chaos. The families of his victims sat through these explanations with growing horror, watching him reduce their daughters and sisters to components in an abstract formula. The execution of Thomas Edward Pritchard occurred on October 15, 1983, at 12:01 a.m. He declined to make a final statement, instead requesting that his photographic collection be donated to the University of Michigan Mathematics Department for academic study. The request was denied, and the photographs were destroyed by court order. Detective Walsh attended the execution as a witness, fulfilling a promise he had made to the victims' families during the investigation. He observed Pritchard's final moments with the same clinical attention that had characterized the entire case, noting the mathematical precision with which the state carried out its own form of organized death. The warehouse in Delray was demolished in November 1983. its contaminated ground converted to industrial storage. The Ford van that Pritchard had used for victim transport was crushed and recycled, its metal contributing to new vehicles that carried no memory of its previous purpose. The yellow Trans Am was sold at police auction, purchased by a collector who restored it to original condition without knowledge of its history. Margaret Chen's dance bag was returned to her family in California, along with personal effects recovered from Pritchard's home. Her parents established a scholarship fund for young dancers, creating something positive from their daughter's death. Donna Kellerman's Volkswagen Beetle remained in the Hamtramck police impound lot until 1985, when it was finally sold to cover storage fees. The investigation had revealed the vulnerability that existed in the spaces between police jurisdictions, the way a methodical predator could exploit bureaucratic boundaries to avoid detection. Wayne County implemented new protocols for sharing missing person information across municipal lines. Though these changes came too late to help Pritchard's victims, Detective Walsh transferred to the FBI Academy in Quantico in 1984, where he helped develop protocols for identifying serial killer patterns across multiple jurisdictions. His experience with the Pritchard case contributed to federal guidelines for investigating predators who crossed county and state lines in pursuit of victims. The mathematical sophistication of Pritchard's signature fascinated behavioral analysts, who recognized the pattern as evidence of an organized killer operating at an unusually high level of abstraction. Most serial killers left signatures that reflected psychological needs or sexual compulsions. Pritchard had created something closer to art, using human death as raw material for mathematical expression. The families of his victims struggled to understand this abstraction of their loss. Margaret Chen's mother spent years trying to comprehend how her daughter had become a number in a Fibonacci sequence, how a young woman's dreams of dancing professionally had been reduced to a position in a spiral pattern. The mathematics provided no comfort, only additional evidence of the killer's complete disconnection from human empathy. Thomas Pritchard's death marked the end of a case that had demonstrated the intersection between mental disorder and mathematical genius, between organized planning and psychotic detachment. He had killed 7 women to create a pattern that existed only in his mind, sacrificing human lives to achieve a perfection that no one else could perceive or appreciate. The Tuesday nights in Detroit's entertainment district returned to normal patterns after Pritchard's execution. Dancers emerged from clubs at closing time, walked to their cars or bus stops, returned safely to their apartments and families. The yellow Trans Am's absence went unnoticed, replaced by the anonymous flow of traffic that characterized urban nightlife. In the end, Thomas Edward Pritchard had achieved his perfect stillness, not through the arrangement of photographs, but through the silence of death. His mathematical theories died with him, leaving only the memory of 7 women who had been transformed into numbers in an equation that solved for nothing but loss. The warehouse's demolished foundation settled into Detroit's industrial landscape, indistinguishable from hundreds of other sites where manufacturing had once provided structure to working-class lives. The city rebuilt itself around these empty spaces, creating new patterns of commerce and residence that buried the old configurations beneath progress. Detective Walsh kept copies of the case files in his FBI office, referencing them whenever he encountered killers who imposed intellectual frameworks on their crimes. The Pritchard case served as a reminder that intelligence and education could amplify rather than prevent criminal behavior, creating predators who operated with terrifying efficiency and complete moral absence. The mathematical beauty of the Fibonacci spiral continued to appear throughout nature, in nautilus shells and sunflower seed patterns, in galaxy formations and DNA structures. Thomas Pritchard's attempt to impose this pattern on human death had been an obscene corruption of natural order, a demonstration that intelligence without empathy produced only sophisticated destruction. Years later, when FBI profilers encountered killers who left mathematical signatures or arranged victims according to geometric patterns, they referenced the Pritchard case as evidence that organized intelligence could serve evil as efficiently as good. The case files contained photographs of the spiral arrangement, documentation of a mind that had transformed murder into mathematics with clinical precision. The families of Pritchard's victims gradually rebuilt their lives around the permanent absence of daughters and sisters. They attended trials of other killers, advocated for improved missing person procedures, created memorial scholarships and support groups. Their activism helped prevent other families from experiencing the same loss, though it could never restore what Thomas Edward Pritchard had taken from them. Margaret Chen's mother returned to Detroit in 1995, 12 years after her daughter's killer had been executed. She visited the site where the Delray warehouse had stood, finding only an empty lot grown over with weeds and scattered with industrial debris. The mathematical precision of her daughter's death seemed even more horrifying in this setting of natural chaos and urban decay. She stood in the space where her daughter had died and tried to understand the mind that had seen beauty in arranged death, that had found perfection in the elimination of life. The understanding never came. Some patterns, she realized, were meant to remain incomprehensible to minds that still possessed the capacity for love and loss. The wind moved through the empty lot, disturbing papers and plastic bags in patterns that followed no mathematical sequence. This randomness, this chaos, seemed more honest than Thomas Edward Pritchard's calculated arrangements. Life itself resisted the imposition of perfect order, finding meaning in spontaneity and surprise, rather than in the cold precision of numbered death. Detroit's dancers continued their work in clubs throughout the city, their Tuesday nights unmarked by the memory of yellow Trans Ams or spiral patterns. They emerged from venues at closing time, walked to their cars, drove home safely to apartments and families. The city's rhythm accommodated their movement without the interference of mathematical predators or calculated observation. In this return to normal patterns, in this restoration of random safety, the victims of Thomas Edward Pritchard found their only justice. His perfect stillness had been replaced by the imperfect motion of ongoing life, his calculated death by the chaotic survival of others, who danced and dreamed and departed safely into Detroit's illuminated night.